it's kind of funny when changes happen and you can now start to poke fun at power. So it's really cool now to make fun of large organizations. It's kind of like how back in the days I was a rapper. No, I was. A stylist in the video. And hip hop was really cool, and we're doing all, and it became really cool, right? It was a really cool thing to do. And then white kids started rapping. That's like the equivalent of a large organization trying to act like a startup. So, can you get where I'm going with this? Right? And so it became really fun to make fun of white rappers. So it was like Vanilla Ice, And then there was another rapper, his name was Milkbone or something. And he was pretty close to being good, but he was still a white rapper. And so we kept making fun of white rappers and white kids with baggy trousers and heads to the side. Just like they're trying to be down, but they're not down, right? And so that's the same thing we're doing is large corporates suck. They could never do innovation like startups, right? And so we kept making fun of white rappers until it turned out that Eminem is the best rapper ever, right? So Eminem came, and he became the best rapper ever. And so, okay, now we can't make fun of white rappers anymore. And in the same way, my presentation is really about how large corporates can become Eminem, right? How they can actually start to innovate like startups in a way that allows them to use the resources they actually have. Because you can imagine, with the amount of resources that large corporates have, if they also did innovation the right way, then they could really, really make fun of startups. So it would be a way to actually invert that. And the reason why I call it deliberately emergent strategy is that I actually think that with the advent of tools like lean startup, business model design, customer development, lean UX, all these tools really allow large corporates to actually start to have a conversation with the emergent side of their strategy. You see, startups have been able to use these tools to sort of manage the uncertainty of the work that they do, and I think that large organizations can actually do the same. So let's start off with making fun of large corporates. This is how you used to get your movies. This was Blockbuster. You drive to the store, pull the DVD off the shelf, drive all the way back home. And I heard somewhere that actually the people that used to manage Blockbuster thought that they were in the business of managing a shopping experience. That was the customer job to be done, the shopping experience. And then, of course, Netflix came, and this is now how we watch movies. Right? We watch them on our laptops, we watch them on our tablets, et cetera, and this is what happened to Blockbuster. So we all know this story. This story is told over and over. It's the story of Nokia, right? Having the #1 phone-making company and then getting knocked off that perch. It's the story of Kodak. It's the story of Borders getting kicked off by Amazon. Over and over, we actually hear this story. And the biggest challenge that large organizations have when they're trying to innovate is the fact that they're large organizations. It's kind of like your father trying to be cool. I mean, he was cool once, but it's really hard to be cool. So that's why you don't even want him near your friends or anything, because you start telling those jokes, right? And so what we've learned, right, is that long ago, startups used to try and imitate large companies. And Steve Blank showed us that startups are not like large companies. They're engaged in searching for sustainable business models. And large companies are large because they're successful. They made money, right? They made loads of money. And so their job is to execute on known business models. Now, the problem with executing on a known business model is that it makes it really hard for you to execute on a known business model and search for a sustainable business model, and execute on a known business model and search for the sustainable business model all in the same organization. Right? How do you actually do this in a way that you can succeed? And the biggest challenge that large companies have is that the thing that's making them rich is the cash cow. So the cow at the bottom, that one, that's what's making them rich. Right? They've got a really, really high market share, but they have the high market share in a market that's sort of growing very slowly. But at the same time, they have to pay the bills, right? They have to keep this cash cow giving them money because actually it's that money that they end up investing in the innovation in the first place. So if they don't actually keep the cash cow feeding them cash, then the company would have to close down. Then it doesn't really matter, because if the company is closed down, then it can't do disruptive innovation anyway. So in a sense, they have to keep sustaining the cash cow. But they have to be careful that they don't end up in this state where they're milking the cash cow for one last supply of milk before the cow falls over and dies. All right? So while they're doing this, they have to be simultaneously raising new cows so that they can actually milk later. So the question is, how do they actually do this in a way that is actually sustainable? One of the challenges that they also have when they're large companies is that the numbers or the metrics that they use to sort of manage the big piece that's making them money are not really useful for managing innovation. So things like ROI, ARRR, accounting rate of return, net present value, what's the other one? Payback period, et cetera, et cetera. Like, if you don't even know what the customer problem is, there is no payback period, right? If you don't know whether or not you're building a product that anybody wants, there is no net present value. Like, you're not even really creating value for customers yet. So there are correct metrics for measuring whether or not you're making stuff people want. And there are correct metrics for managing a business that's already making stuff people want. Right? But if you actually mix up the two, then you're much more likely to get into trouble. You're much more likely to dismiss as unsuccessful products that could be potentially successful because they don't actually hit your ROI metrics. Right? And so that's why large companies also struggle with this. So this is a really, really good cartoon for illustrating the difference between a startup and a large corporate. It's kind of just making fun, I guess. But a startup is pushing a boulder up the hill and trying to find a sustainable business model. And the truth is that a startup is more like the curse of Sisyphus. Any of you ever heard of that? The curse of Sisyphus, the Greek myth about the guy who was cursed to push a boulder up the rock, watch it fall down, then have to do it again for the rest of his life. That's like build, measure, learn. Build, measure, learn, right? So a startup is doing this every day, all day. It's frustrating, and then eventually they get the system to work, right? And then they start to do that now. And there's different individuals that can actually sort of run on the treadwheel successfully because you're sustaining a business model that works. Now, if you're going to be an ambidextrous organization, which is an organization that does both, you actually have to run on the treadmill and push a rock up a hill at the same time. Now the question is, how do you actually do this in a way that's actually sustainable? And now there's a lot of research going on in the academic space about what they call the ambidextrous organization, which are organizations that are able to simultaneously manage these two types of business behavior, if you want to call it that. And what the theory is, or what they found, I think is Tushman and O'Reilly, those are the names of the researchers. What they actually found was that what these organizations do is they separate the divisions that manage the sustaining innovation, and then they put the divisions that are doing the breakthrough innovation in a separate place. I don't know whether this is actually the right thing to do in terms of like siloing people, but what they want to do is to separate the cultures so that one culture doesn't dominate the other culture, and then you sort of lose everything because you're trying to mix it together when it doesn't really work together. But then what they say is for the organization to succeed at being ambidextrous, at some point, these two parts of the business have to have a conversation. They have to meet somewhere. And what they say is that this conversation should be had in the C-suite. The CEOs, the CFOs, the CMOs, whoever is in the C-suite are the people that manage this conversation. And the individuals that are running these different types of departments are supposed to have an equally powerful seat at the board. So that when the conversation is actually being had, the individuals that are presenting the metrics that are involved in innovation can protect the resources that they're working with, and the individuals that are working in the divisions that are doing sustaining can also protect the resources that they're working with. And it's up to the ambidextrous CEO, which is the other phrase they coined, to balance this particular conversation. And the question is, how do you actually really do that and do it well? Now, there are many, many, many things that you could say about how you do this in practice in terms of implementation, but my talk is really about orientation, about like the mind state of the organization doing this. And so that's why I want to talk about strategies. How do you get the C-suite to get their mind right, to get focused on the right things when they're actually trying to manage this strategy? Now, traditionally, strategy is thought of as a deliberate plan. If you look at the dictionary definition of strategy, it's a plan to achieve some long-term goal. Now, the problem with plans and calling anything plans is that there's nothing that's really predictable anymore. The pace of change in society nowadays is so quick. Economic change is so quick. Technological change is so quick that if all you do is make a plan and execute on a plan, you're also going to be likely to fail, even if you're a large organization or whether you're a small organization or whether you're a startup. Okay? So deliberate planning is really useful, but to then execute on that plan without getting any data can actually be dangerous. This is one of the types of sort of top-down planning tools that are used. This is Porter's generic strategies. And so what you do with this is you decide whether or not you want to be an organization that's focused on cost or an organization that's focused on differentiation. And then you decide whether or not you want to go for the mass market or whether you want to go for like a niche market, right? And then you can decide, okay, we're going to be cost leadership. That's our deliberate strategy, and that's what we're going to be executing on. Everybody in the organization, go out there and do cost leadership. The question is that the right way to do it? Is that the correct way to do it? Can you manage this well? Are you going to survive if you do it in that way? And the truth is, no plan survives first contact with customers. We've heard that one. It's also true for large corporates. No strategic plan survives first contact with the implementation of that strategy. Okay, so what Mintzberg argues is that strategy is actually emergent. So rather than defining strategy as something that's actually deliberate, you sort of look for strategy in the patterns that emerge as the organization tries to sort of survive and sell and make money, right? So you get this emergent strategy that sort of comes in, and then the organization is sort of adapt and learn from customers and learn from the managers and the salespeople that are dealing with people on the ground and use that information to actually inform the strategy, okay? So this is interesting in itself. But one thing that's really fundamental that we really need to understand is that when it comes to lean startup, when it comes to science even, just the scientific method itself, there's a really big difference between being data-driven and being hypothesis-driven, right? This is really important. Like, take that in for a minute. Like, get a tattoo or whatever. There's a really big difference between being hypothesis-driven and being data-driven, okay? Being data-driven, if you're data-driven, it actually means you don't learn anything because you don't have a framework for interpretation, right? If you're just sort of using a plan and just implementing a plan, you don't learn anything either because you don't actually listen to any feedback that you're actually getting, right? The only way to learn anything is to have a hypothesis-driven approach to what you do. So your ideas and your thoughts and your thinking become the hypotheses that you test using the data that's actually emerging. So if you just go out and collect data without any hypotheses, you don't have a framework for interpretation, right? And if you go and just implement your hypothesis without collecting any data, you don't learn anything either. So what actually should really happen and what really happens in organizations is that it's a mishmash. It's usually a mishmash of deliberate strategy and emergent strategy, right? The CEO and the C-suite have an idea of where they think the organization should be going, so they nudge the organization in that direction, and then there's pushback from the market, and then they respond to that pushback from the market and try and steer the organization in a direction that's much more sustainable. Because you know the joke about if you just follow the data, you're much more likely to end up with like a gambling site or a site that sells drugs or whatever, because I was working with some students on a lean startup project, and their initial idea was that they wanted to do a company in which they provided cheap, healthy food to students. So they went and did their customer development, and they came back from their customer development and said, we spoke to a lot of students, and all the students said, we don't have any problem with cheap, healthy food. What we want is cheap alcohol. Right? So, and they said, well, see, Dr. Vicky, you told us that we're supposed to listen to the customers, so now what we're going to do is we're going to do a site where we sell cheap alcohol to students. So I was just like, hold on there, wait a minute. You went from healthy food to cheap alcohol in one experiment? All right? And that's the whole point about, are we data-driven or are we hypothesis-driven? Is there some sort of constraint to the data where we apply our vision to that, right? And so the truth is this is actually what really happens. And in his later writing, Mintzberg also started arguing that actually an organization's realized strategy is a mixture of the deliberate strategy and the emergent strategy. So that makes sense. But there's still a big question there, which is, well, how do you put it together? Do you just sort of like sit there and go, this is a deliberate strategy, but this stuff is coming in? Like, how do you do that? How do you actually put it together? What is the systematic way for the C-suite to put this together, right? And this is where the Lean Startup Toolbox is really, really powerful. And it really struck me while I was doing my work thinking, wow, this is actually amazing. It's an opportunity for large organizations to actually use this toolbox to build a conversation between the deliberate strategy and the emergent strategy, right? And the way to do this is this complex thing that I drew, but it's actually not that complicated. Let's look at the top. That's the organization, right? And at the bottom are the organization's customers. Okay? So in deliberate strategy, the organization would push down its strategic vision down into the organization. But if the organization thought for a moment that its strategic vision were a set of hypotheses that need to be tested, then what it would do is it would use the strategic vision to guide the hypotheses that are being generated, which would then go into the innovation sandbox, i.e. the divisions that are launching the new products and services, and then those divisions would be empowered to test the strategic vision with experiments. And these experiments would be done with customers, and the data from customers would then become the emergent strategy, which would be data, which goes through the innovation sandbox back to the organization. It's like the build, measure, learn loop, but at a strategic level. Right? And so what the organization would be demanding from their managers is for them to give them data that refutes the strategic vision. Could we be wrong about our strategic vision? Rather than asking managers, we told you to do X, Y, Z, how far have you gone in executing X, Y, Z? Right? So the conversation becomes just a little bit different. And so the tools that I'm talking about, the customer development, the experimentation, the minimum viable product, all the metrics that we collect using the analytics that we use, they're in here. They're inside the innovation sandbox, or the innovation colony as well. It's been called in a more recent book. Right? And so this becomes a platform where the divisions that are even working on the deliberate strategy and working on what the company is already known for can have a conversation with the divisions that are working on the breakthrough products, right? Because it's a conversation between two sides of the business. And it's not a data-driven conversation, but it's a data-informed conversation. Because, again, the Innovation Sandbox is doing this work of testing the company's vision. We're writing a book called The Corporate Startup, me and Dan Thoma. Check that out. Thank you.